Some patients just aren't worth the liability. That is what Dr. Thornton said 48 minutes before the veteran arrived who would destroy everything he'd built. Riverside Community Hospital in Jacksonville smells of antiseptic and floor wax under buzzing fluorescent lights that never quite stop humming. The ER moves in its own rhythm, organized chaos, practiced and precise, and within that controlled violence, Megan O'Brien moves like water finding cracks. She's been invisible here for 2 years. That was the point. She doesn't introduce herself to the new residents. She doesn't attend the staff happy hours on Thursdays. She doesn't have a locker decorated with photos or a favorite coffee mug with her name. Her badge photo is 3 years old, her credentials file minimal, references that check out, background clear, nothing that invites questions. When patients code, she appears. When the monitors spike and the room goes electric with urgency, her hands move with the kind of certainty that makes doctors instinctively step back and let her work. Then the crisis passes, and she disappears again into the linen closet or the supply room or the back office where no one has to look at her. The staff notices things but doesn't ask about them. The faint limp on her left side, she favors it after long shifts, but she never mentions an injury. The scars running up her forearms like railroad tracks, visible when she rolls her sleeves, pale and old and deliberate. The way she moves in trauma situations, not with panic but with something older, something that predates the ER by decades. The way her eyes track exits in every room. The muscle in her jaw that tightens when certain words are said, deployment, combat, sacrifice, words that shouldn't affect a hospital nurse but do. Megan's locker is in the far corner of the staff room, behind the water cooler where no one lingers. Inside, beneath 3 perfectly folded pairs of scrubs, sits a tarnished challenge coin. She touches it once at the beginning of each shift and once at the end, running her thumb over the Special Forces insignia worn smooth from 18 years of handling. The emblem is barely visible now, intentionally so. A casual observer would see only an old coin, something a grandfather might have carried, nothing that screams commander. Nothing that screams ghost. The fluorescent lights flicker. A monitor beeps 3 rooms over. The ER is half full at 11:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, a drunk with a forehead laceration, an elderly woman with chest pain, a construction worker with a crushed hand. Standard morning chaos. Megan is restocking the trauma cart in Bay 3, checking medications with the methodical precision of someone who understands that small oversights kill people. That's when the overhead page crackles. Incoming trauma. Disabled veteran. Multiple facility refusals. ETA for minutes. Megan's hands pause on the epinephrine vial. Not hesitation. Just pause. The kind of pause that lasts one breath. Multiple facility refusals means the man has been turned away elsewhere. It means some combination of his condition, his insurance, or his appearance made him undesirable to other hospitals. In the business of modern medicine, undesirable means unprofitable. Undesirable means someone has already made a calculation about whether saving his life is worth the administrative overhead. She continues counting medications. The cart is already stocked. She's just buying her hand something to do. Dr. Marcus Thornton enters the ER through the main doors, and Megan doesn't need to look to know it's him. She knows his walk, the unhurried stride of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. She knows the tone of his voice before he speaks, pitched at a level meant to carry without seeming to try. He's on his phone, already moving toward the nursing station. "Yeah, I'm in the ER now," he's saying. "Listen, I'm going to need you to have a bed ready at the VA facility. We're about to receive a disabled veteran, probably going to need immediate transfer. No, I don't have the details yet, but I can already tell you we don't have the resources." He's not even looking at the ambulance bay doors. He's already written the ending. Megan has worked in hospitals long enough to understand the economic machinery that runs beneath the Hippocratic Oath. She's old enough to remember when medicine was something other than a business forecasting model. She's seen enough of both worlds to know which one wins in the long run. What she doesn't know is that the man in the ambulance bay is Major Calhoun. She doesn't know that he's been rejected by 5 hospitals in 4 hours. She doesn't know that he's been waiting 12 years for someone to tell him his legs might have been worth saving if he'd had different insurance. She doesn't know that in 60 seconds, the waiting will end, not because anyone suddenly grew a conscience, but because of a choice she hasn't made yet. The ambulance bay doors burst open. The rotor wash outside means a helicopter flight is coming from somewhere far enough that the ground ambulance alone wouldn't cut it. The paramedics are moving fast. Too fast. 28-year-old male, spinal cord injury, vehicle versus tree, estimated 80 miles per hour impact, paralyzed from Tier 7 down, vital stable at scene but deteriorating in transport, BP dropping, oxygen sat 92% on non-rebreather. The paramedic's voice is rapid fire, trained, the vocabulary of crisis. Require surgical evaluation for potential spinal fusion, neuroassessment. We've called ahead to 3 facilities, all beds full, 1 refused, 2 said they'd need transfer authorization from insurance. Insurance. Even dying, the gatekeeping never stops. The stretcher rolls toward Bay 1, and Megan moves without deciding to move. Her body already knows the pattern. She reaches the bay as they're transferring the patient from the gurney to the hospital bed, rapid movement, coordination, the choreography of hands that have done this 1,000 times. And then she sees his face. The patient is dark-skinned, young, muscular despite the obvious paralysis, and his eyes are conscious and aware even though his body is immobilized on a spine board. There's a military bearing to him that transcends the injury, something in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw. She's seen that bearing before. It lives in specific corners of the world where men learn to carry weight that doesn't show on scales. Her hands keep moving. Vitals to the monitor. Pulse oximetry. For access check. Her face doesn't change. But her mind is somewhere else, somewhere 18 months ago, at a grocery store in Tampa where her son Tyler came home on leave and walked her through the dining room introducing his commanding officer. Major Calhoun. Special Forces. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The man who'd had Tyler's back through 3 tours and 2 ambushes. Major Calhoun is on the spine board in front of her, paralyzed from the chest down, and the calculation in Dr. Thornton's eyes as he approaches the bay is already complete. What do we have? Thornton asks, but he's not asking Megan. He's addressing the room, the paramedics, the nurse, the air itself, anyone but her. The paramedic recites the information again. Thornton nods, glancing at the monitor, already pulling out his clipboard. Megan watches him scan the chart, and she sees the exact moment when his brain processes the economics. Spinal cord injury. Rehabilitation required. Long-term care. Insurance questions. Administrative burden. I'm documenting this as stable on transfer, Thornton says to the paramedic. We need to get him to the VA immediately. They have the spinal cord injury center. We don't have the resources here. It's a lie so smooth it almost sounds like protocol. Megan has heard the lie before, spoken in 100 different hospitals by 100 different Thorntons. The lie that sounds like medicine but means something else entirely. The lie that translated says, this man will cost us more than he will profit us. She moves to the monitor and begins taking his vitals herself. BP is 118/76, not dropping like the paramedic said, which means the situation has stabilized or never was as critical as reported. O2 sat 95% on the non-rebreather, which is normal. The man's eyes track hers as she works, and for a moment, just a moment, recognition flickers across his face. He knows her. Not because they've met, but because he knows her son. He's seen photos. He's heard stories. And right now, paralyzed and stripped of agency, Major Calhoun is watching the man who wants to disappear him with absolute professional courtesy. Get neurology on the phone, Thornton says. Tell them we need an immediate transfer authorization. We don't have the capacity for spinal cord rehabilitation. It's not that kind of facility. Megan's hand is on Calhoun's shoulder, not an emotional touch, just professional contact, the kind a nurse gives to a frightened patient. But she can feel him trembling. Not from pain. From the understanding that his value has just been calculated and found insufficient. She moves to the computer terminal to enter the initial assessment. Her fingers hover over the keyboard for 1 second, then move, documenting vitals, documenting his coherence, documenting everything that proves he's salvageable, that he's worth the effort. Behind her, Dr. Thornton is already making calls, already triggering the machinery that will move Calhoun somewhere else, somewhere cheaper, somewhere that won't affect his department's profit margins. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part comes when Megan sees what Thornton writes in his notes. She's supposed to be focused on her own charting, but the computer stations are positioned so she can see his screen, and her eyes catch on the lie before her brain fully registers it. He's documented Calhoun as stable for transfer, non-emergent, and recommended the VA based on multiple failed aggressive interventions at field. Multiple failed interventions. Which is medical code for, we tried and he's not worth saving. Which is a lie. Which is fraud designed to create a paper trail that justifies turning a paralyzed veteran away from a hospital that has the capacity to help him. Megan's jaw tightens. Just tightens. That's all. Her hands remain steady on the keyboard. Her voice, when she speaks to the patient, remains soft and professional. Major, I'm going to get you some pain medication while we arrange your transfer. Your vitals are strong. That's a good sign. It's the closest thing to reassurance she can offer without exposing what she's just witnessed. Thornton glances at her, and for a moment their eyes meet. She sees nothing in his expression, no calculation, no awareness, no understanding that he's just committed fraud in front of someone who actually knows how to read a medical chart. To him, she's just a nurse. A helpful shadow. Someone who'll accept the narrative and move on. He has no idea who she is. The overhead page crackled across the entire 4th floor of Riverside Community Hospital at 2:47 p.m., and every nurse within earshot went still for half a second before the smirk started. Nurse Nightingale to Station 3. Nurse Nightingale to Station 3. The words hung in the fluorescent lit air like a blade. In the break room, a resident whispered something to an intern and both of them laughed, not a genuine laugh, but the kind of sound predators make when they've smelled blood in the water. 2 doors down, a unit secretary repeated it under her breath, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Nurse Nightingale. The name was surgical precision disguised as a compliment. It meant she was soft. Weak. The kind of nurse who stopped to hold dying patients' hands instead of rushing through her shift. The kind of nurse who deserved to be broken. Megan O'Brien heard it from inside Trauma Bay 2, where she was restocking the crash cart, muscle memory moving her hands, positioning the defibrillator pads in their exact slots, checking the epinephrine doses one more time. Her fingers didn't pause. Her breathing stayed steady. But something inside her chest compressed into a fist, and the sensation was familiar enough that she recognized it. It was the same thing that happened when incoming fire started, when the world narrowed to survival and sound and the precise calculation of who lived and who didn't. She turned and walked toward Station 3 without hurrying, without slowing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like cicadas, that endless hospital white noise that got into your bones if you weren't careful. Her badge swung against her ribs with each step, and underneath it, pressed against her chest in the pocket of her scrubs, the tarnished military challenge coin felt like it weighed 3 pounds. Station 3 was empty. She knew it would be. That was the point. 20 minutes later, around 3:15 p.m., Megan was in the supply closet on the east wing, restocking saline bags on the 3rd shelf, a task that required a ladder, focus, and the kind of solitude that made her dangerous if you were foolish enough to corner her there. She was reaching for the next box when the door closed behind her with a click that sounded like a gun's safety coming off. Dr. Thornton stood in the narrow space between the shelves, his white coat precise and spotless, his tie a power color that probably had a name she didn't know and wouldn't have cared about. He was one of those doctors who looked like he'd been assembled in a genetics lab specifically to Project Authority, 62 years old, silver temples, the kind of jawline that came from generations of money and privilege. He'd been at Riverside for 17 years, long enough to cultivate a network of board members and administrators who returned his favors in kind. Long enough that a nurse, any nurse, was essentially invisible to him, a maintenance task that occasionally required brief, contemptuous attention. "You misunderstood what you saw with that patient's chart," Thornton said. His voice was low and measured, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The disabled veteran. Major Calhoun. You need to understand that I've been practicing emergency medicine since before you learned to take a temperature, Nurse O'Brien. I don't make documentation errors. I don't make clinical errors. What do you think you saw, the vitals, the saturation readings, whatever narrative you've constructed in your mind, was your inexperience interpreting data in a high-pressure situation. The supply closet smelled like plastic and antiseptic, and something underneath it all, the faint chemical scent of bleach cutting through organic decay." Megan remained on the ladder, her hand still extended toward the saline box. Her jaw tightened once, a single visible reaction, the kind that took enormous discipline to limit to one. She could have thrown him through the wall. She could have done it easily, could have used the precise amount of force to break his collarbone and maybe crack 3 ribs, could have done it without thinking because her hands remembered Kandahar and they remembered worse. Instead, she climbed down the ladder with deliberate slowness and turned to face him. "If you suggest to anyone, the board, administration, anyone at all, that you witnessed any discrepancy in my documentation or my clinical judgment, I will personally ensure you never work in healthcare again," Thornton continued. He was close enough now that she could see the capillaries in his eyes, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively mediocre. "Your references will be destroyed. Your licenses will be questioned. Your background will be reviewed by investigators until they find something to prosecute. Do you understand me?" Megan's hands hung at her sides. The muscles in her forearms had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before violence, but she'd trained for years to recognize that feeling and to replace it with something else, not patience, because she'd never been patient, but control. The same control that kept her breathing steady when mortars landed close enough to shake loose teeth from your jaw. The same control that let you perform emergency cricothyrotomy on a soldier with a collapsed airway when your hands were covered in his blood and you had 90 seconds before his brain started dying from hypoxia. "I understand," she said. Her voice was flat, neutral, the voice of someone reading from a script. That was the most important part, the absolute absence of emotion. Thornton needed to see compliance. He needed to see a nurse who was cowed, broken, chastened. He needed to see defeat. What he saw was stillness. What he got was a stare that didn't blink or flinch or betray anything at all. It seemed to unsettle him slightly because he took a small step back, and then he nodded once and left the closet, pulling the door shut behind him. Megan remained motionless for exactly 30 seconds after he left. Her breathing was controlled. Her heart rate was elevated but manageable. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat that wasn't her own, the weight of it, the familiarity of its worn edges, the way it carried the ghost of every decision she'd made the night she decided to walk away from her life and become invisible. 3 days later, at the end of the night shift, Megan walked through the ER toward the staff exit. It was 6:47 a.m., and the morning light was beginning to seep through the windows in that pale yellow way that made everything look like it was slightly dying. Her scrubs were damp with sweat and other people's fluids, the basic uniform of anyone who'd spent 8 hours trying to keep human beings from falling apart. She'd worked a reduced shift, assigned to pediatrics, away from the trauma bays. Away from Major Calhoun. Away from anything that might allow her to witness something she shouldn't have witnessed. The glass doors of Riverside Community's main entrance were visible from the parking lot, and everyone leaving the night shift could see through them. Everyone could see who was walking out and in what order and what their faces looked like. That was the architecture of institutional power, the glass doors, the visibility, the audience. Dr. Thornton caught up with her in the parking lot itself, his voice carrying that same smooth confidence, the tone of a man delivering news that was both inevitable and deserved. "Effective immediately, you're being moved to part-time status," he said. They were roughly the same distance apart as they'd been in the supply closet, but here the morning air was open and cold and the hospital staff watched from inside the glass doors like spectators at an execution. Budget cuts. The economy, you understand. Healthcare margins are tightening. We're looking at reductions across the board. Megan's expression didn't change. Her face was carved from something harder than bone. Maybe the VA is hiring, Thornton continued, and he smiled, not the smile of someone delivering bad news, but the smile of someone savoring a victory. Might be a better fit for your skill level anyway. Fewer complications. Megan nodded once. A single, economical acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked to her car, her pace steady, her shoulders level, her breathing exactly as controlled as it had been in the supply closet. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could feel the weight of every eye from her shift, the nurses she'd worked beside for 2 years, the residents she'd trained, the attendings she'd supported, all of them watching as she was publicly demolished. She opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. The car smelled like the vinyl seat covers and stale coffee from the drive-in that morning. The steering wheel was cold under her hands. Then, alone in the privacy of her own vehicle, Megan gripped the wheel with both hands and squeezed until her knuckles turned white, until the tendons stood up like cables under her skin. Her jaw clenched so hard she felt the pain radiate down her neck. The challenge coin, that tarnished piece of metal that carried the weight of 37 lives and 2 purple hearts and a decision she'd made in the dark, pressed against her ribs, pressing inward, pressing against the barrier between who she had been and who she'd convinced herself she was. She couldn't see herself in the rearview mirror. Couldn't bear to. What she could do was sit there, knuckles whitening, jaw locked, and remember that sometimes the quietest response was the most dangerous one. Sometimes the person who didn't scream was the person holding back something that could break the world. And sometimes, when you'd spent 18 months trying to disappear, trying to be invisible, trying to become something small enough that no one would ever look for you, sometimes someone forced you to remember exactly what you'd buried. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., the code alarm would scream. Megan would hear it from pediatrics, where she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Major Calhoun's floor. And in that moment, gripping the challenge coin in her pocket, feeling the weight of every choice that had led her to this hospital, to this night, to this man who was about to die if she didn't act, she would make a decision that would undo everything. The night shifts came in shorter now. Part-time. That was what they called it, part-time, as if reducing her to 30 hours a week was mercy instead of erasure. Megan moved through Riverside Community Hospital like a ghost moving through a place that no longer wanted to see her. 3 weeks had passed since the parking lot announcement. 3 weeks of watching the staff's eyes slide away when she clocked in, of being assigned to the least critical patients, of standing alone in the break room while conversation stopped mid-sentence. She didn't mind. Solitude had always been her native language. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat, the weight she'd carried through 2 years of anonymity, now heavier with the knowledge of what she'd witnessed. Dr. Thornton's falsified chart for Major Calhoun. The deliberate decision to transfer a disabled veteran, a man her own son had served under, to clear a bed for someone more profitable. She'd seen it happen. She'd held the evidence in her hands. And now she waited, knowing that waiting was a form of survival. Thornton was building something. A network. She could hear it in the whispered phone calls behind his office door, in the sudden visits from board members wearing expensive watches and expensive smiles. Megan passed his office on her way to the supply closet on a Tuesday evening, and his door stood slightly ajar. The voice that came through was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that knew how to ask favors from people who already owed him. "Yes, I understand completely," Thornton said. "Lucrative referrals require discretion. I've sent 12 cases to specialty surgical partners alone this year. 7 figures. Your board members remember that, I trust." A pause. The sound of ice clinking against glass. The issue isn't the patient. It's the nurse. She's become a liability. References need to be questioned. Credentials need examination. I want an outside investigator, someone clean, someone who owes nothing to this hospital. Can you arrange that by Friday? Megan didn't stop walking. She didn't pause. Her hands remained steady as she collected gauze and compression bandages, arranged them in the metal bin with the precision of someone organizing weapons before deployment. The words had registered, catalogued, stored in the same part of her brain that had learned to identify hostile forces in a crowded marketplace. He was going to dismantle her. Not quickly. Not cleanly. But systematically, the way competent people destroyed threats. By Wednesday, the nursing agency that had placed her at Riverside called. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Thornton had contacted them directly, questioning her references, her credentials, her background. He'd been careful, professional, concerned, the picture of a responsible hospital administrator looking out for patient safety. When had she obtained her nursing degree? Could they verify her previous employment history? Were there any incidents in her file? Any gaps in employment that couldn't be explained? The recruiter's voice had been apologetic but firm. They needed to do a full background review. Routine. Nothing to worry about. Just procedure. Megan had said, of course, and hung up the phone without another word. The hospital laundry hummed with the sound of industrial washers, the antiseptic smell of bleach mixing with hot steam. She folded her scrubs during her breaks now, something she'd never done before, feeling the cotton crease under her fingers like a ritual. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their frequency the same as the ones in the trauma bay at Bagram, and for a moment, just a moment, she was back there, surgical lights brilliant above her face, her hands working on a Marine whose name she would never know but whose blood type she could still recite. The outside investigator arrived on Thursday. His name was Dr. Marcus Hayes, a physician who specialized in credentialing reviews. He was thin, precise, the kind of man who wore everything like a uniform, pressed shirt, polished shoes, folder held like a classified briefing. He spent 6 hours in Riverside's administrative offices, requesting files, making phone calls, building a portrait of Commander Megan O'Brien that consisted entirely of shadows and gaps. Where had she worked before Riverside? Riverside. How many years? 2 years. Education prior to nursing? Classified. Employment history prior to Riverside? Not available. Military service? Not listed. Gaps in background? Significant. Thornton had orchestrated this like a surgeon mapping an incision. The nursing agency would flag her now. Future employers would call. Questions would multiply. And she would have no answers, because the answers belonged to a life that didn't officially exist anymore, to a woman who had signed away her identity for the sake of staying alive. Megan worked her shifts. She moved between rooms, taking vital signs, adjusting for drips, responding to call bells with the quiet efficiency of someone performing tasks from muscle memory. She spoke only when necessary. She made no eye contact. She was exactly what Thornton wanted her to be, or invisible, expendable, alone. But she was listening. On Friday, she overheard Thornton in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, voice like a tank idling in a garage, controlled, deliberate, assured. The investigator found significant gaps. Credentials that can't be verified. A background that doesn't make sense. I'm recommending we place her on unpaid administrative leave pending full review. By next week, she'll be off this floor. By the week after, she'll be off this hospital. The patient situation will be resolved quietly. No complications. No witnesses. Megan stood outside the supply closet, holding a box of sterile gloves, and let the word settle into her like stone sinking into deep water. Thornton had moved past humiliation. He had moved into strategy, deploying institutions, networks, the weight of bureaucratic machinery that moved slowly but inevitably toward the conclusion he'd already decided. Major Calhoun was scheduled for discharge on Sunday if his respiratory status remained stable. Stable. The word sat wrong in her chest, because she'd seen his chart, seen the discharge orders that Thornton had signed, seen the notation that his tracheal damage was minor and self-limiting when it was neither minor nor self-limiting. A man with compromised breathing didn't walk out of a hospital. He collapsed. And when he did, there would be no one there to catch him. She placed the gloves back on the shelf. The rubber was cold against her fingers, slick with the faint smell of talc and latex. Around her, the hospital hummed with the sounds of its ordinary operations, monitors beeping in distant rooms, the squeak of cart wheels on linoleum, the soft rush of ventilators breathing for people who couldn't breathe for themselves. Sounds she'd heard for 2 years. Sounds she might not hear much longer. The challenge coin in her pocket pressed harder. She touched it through the fabric of her scrubs, feeling the worn edge of the insignia that had once meant everything: Special Forces, Kandahar, 37 lives saved, 1 life she'd sacrificed for, a whole history compressed into a piece of tarnished metal that no casual observer would recognize. Thornton was good. She had to give him that much. Strategic, competent, using institutional weapons that couldn't be touched or fought directly. A man who understood how to make people disappear not with violence but with paperwork, with phone calls, with the slow grinding of systems designed to crush anyone who stood in their way. But he had made one mistake. One critical miscalculation that would echo through everything that came next. He'd assumed she was still trying to hide. Saturday morning arrived with rain hammering the parking lot like applause from some distant crowd, the kind of weather that made the ER fill with people who'd made bad decisions under clear skies. Megan was scheduled for the evening shift. 6 hours before she arrived, a patient alert came through: Major Calhoun, readmitted, respiratory distress, suspected tracheal collapse, ETA 20 minutes. Thornton had no idea. No warning. No chance to manage the narrative or control the outcome. And Megan, standing in her apartment with her scrubs laid out on the bed, felt something shift in her chest, the old muscle memory beginning to wake, the old voice starting to surface underneath the quiet nurse voice she'd worn for so long. Not fear. Something simpler. Something cleaner. Clarity. By the time she arrived at Riverside, the emergency bay was already chaos, sirens still wailing outside, the crash cart being prepped, Dr. Thornton nowhere to be found because he wasn't on call on Saturday nights. Megan clocked in without hesitation and headed straight for trauma. Major Calhoun was already in the bay when she arrived, his face the color of slate, his breathing shallow and labored, his eyes locked on the ER physician in front of him with an expression that held something between recognition and desperation. The right side of his neck was swelling, his skin pulling tight like a drum, his mouth open as if he could pull more air through sheer effort of will. But that wasn't the worst part. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 78. 75. The monitor screamed its alarm into the quiet night shift like a warning no one wanted to hear. Major Calhoun's body convulsed once, twice, his right hand clawing at his throat as if he could tear open his own airway with his fingernails. The tracheal damage from 3 weeks of delayed diagnosis had finally chosen its moment. 3 in the morning. Skeleton crew. One resident too busy with a drunk driver in trauma 2 to notice the silent suffocation happening 6 beds down. Megan heard it before she saw it, that particular sound a human body makes when air becomes impossible, a wet choking gasp that reverberates through a nurse's nervous system like a threat. She was charting at the station, her hands moving through the mechanical motions of a shift that had taught her how to disappear, when the monitor numbers registered in her peripheral vision. Her eyes lifted. The alarms weren't loud yet. They would be. She moved before thinking. The thinking part of her brain, the part that had learned to keep its head down, to be just a nurse, to let the doctors decide, was bypassed entirely. Something older took over. Something that had spent for deployments reading the tiny signs of a body in collapse, the angle of the jaw, the flare of the nostrils, the desperate pulling of intercostal muscles that had nothing left to pull. Megan was at his bedside in 12 seconds. Calhoun's eyes found hers, wide and drowning in air that wouldn't come. His lips were already taking on the pale blue tint of profound hypoxia. 60 seconds. Maybe 90 if his brain was lucky. The ceiling tiles above his bed suddenly seemed very far away. "I'm right here," she said, and her voice dropped into register. Not a question. Not a request. A command delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had held dying men's hands in the dust of Kandahar and learned that panic killed faster than bullets ever could. "You're going to be fine. I've done this before." The resident burst through the curtain 3 seconds later, his face still pale from the drunk driver. "What's happening?" "Cool," but Megan's hand was already moving. She had the scalpel from the crash cart before he finished speaking. Her fingers knew its weight, its balance, the exact angle that would glide through skin without hesitation. The resident saw the blade. His mouth opened. "Nurse, what are you?" "Step back," Megan said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I have a 4-minute window." She didn't wait for permission. Permission was a luxury Major Calhoun couldn't afford. She located the cricothyroid membrane by touch alone, that thin space between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage where a passage to air still existed, and made the incision with the practiced precision of muscle memory that lived deeper than thought. The scalpel hissed through skin, and Calhoun's body arched once as his nervous system registered the violation. The resident moved toward her. "We need the attending. We need him breathing," Megan said flatly. She was already reaching for the plastic casing of a ballpoint pen from the crash cart, her other hand applying pressure to control the bleeding. The pen casing would serve as a makeshift airway tube, crude and temporary but functional. Her fingers worked with the efficiency of someone who had performed this procedure on soldiers bleeding out in a convoy ambush, on Marines with shrapnel in their necks, on men who would have died in the 2 minutes it would take an attending physician to arrive. She inserted the casing through the incision. The resistance as it threaded into position. The sudden, desperate inhalation as air reached his lungs again. "Get me high-flow oxygen," she said, and the resident, a young man named Patterson, she remembered now, from the morning briefing 3 weeks ago, moved without argument. The oxygen came. The saturation climbed. 85. 90. 94. The death blue fading from Calhoun's lips like a stain washing away. His breathing steadied. Became almost normal. The monitors still shrieked their alarms, but they were alarms of recovery now, not collapse. She could hear the code team thundering down the corridor, their feet loud as a military formation on tile, but they wouldn't need the crash cart. They wouldn't need the defibrillator or the emergency thoracotomy tray. They would needed her to explain what procedure she'd performed without authorization, what protocol she'd violated, what her credentials actually were. The first team member burst through the curtain, and then the others, and Megan was already stepping back, her hands clean, her face calm. The scalpel was returned to the tray. Her scrubs showed no blood. Her breathing was steady. She could have been a nurse who'd simply been checking vitals. His trachea was collapsing, she said to the attending who arrived last, a woman named Dr. Reeves. Undiagnosed tracheal damage. I performed an emergency cricothyrotomy at 3:03 a.m. O2 sat was 72 and dropping. I had a 4-minute window before permanent hypoxic brain injury became likely. Dr. Reeves stared at the makeshift airway, then at Megan. Her expression cycled through confusion, then comprehension, then something that looked like professional respect, but before it could fully land, the doors at the end of the corridor swung open and Dr. Thornton appeared, still wearing his street clothes, his phone pressed to his ear. He stopped dead when he saw the code team, the monitors showing stable vitals, Calhoun breathing steadily into the oxygen mask. His face went through its own cycle, surprise, calculation, and then the slow, gathering red of rage that had nothing to do with the patient and everything to do with the witness. He disconnected his phone call. He didn't say anything. He simply stared at Megan with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed leverage dissolve in a single unauthorized moment. By dawn, he had made his calls. The nursing agency received a call at 6:45 a.m. questioning whether their placement had the required credentials for trauma procedures. The hospital board received 7 calls before 8, from colleagues who owed Thornton favors, from physicians he'd sent profitable referrals for years, from administrators whose children attended the same country club. The outside investigator, summoned hastily, arrived at 9 with a file of questions that had nothing to do with Calhoun and everything to do with Megan: inconsistencies in her application history, a gap of 2 years unaccounted for, no documented trauma surgery training on her records, and most critically, a procedure performed without physician supervision, without anesthesia authorization, without any of the documentation that made hospital procedures legal. Thornton had transformed her saving a life into her final violation. By noon, security stood outside his office door. The message was clear before Megan walked through it at 2 p.m. This was her termination. This was the removal of the witness. He was waiting at his desk, his expression the calm confidence of a man with institutional power and no consequences. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't offer her a chair. He simply slid a termination letter across the mahogany surface of his desk with a single finger, as if the paper itself might contaminate him if he touched it directly. "Effective immediately," he said. His voice was smooth as silk. "Protocol violations. Credential irregularities. Insubordination in refusing to defer to physician authority. You performed a procedure without authorization. You could have killed him." Megan read the letter without picking it up. The words blurred into bureaucratic language designed to make murder sound like administrative necessity. She had read similar documents before, but in different contexts, different languages, signing away benefits she'd earned in dust and blood. "I saved his life," she said. Her voice didn't crack. Didn't rise. Didn't beg or explain or justify. Just stated the fact as plainly as stating the weather. "You violated protocol," Thornton repeated. He was enjoying this, the finality of it, the way he could unmake her official existence with a single signature. "Sign the letter. Turn in your ID. Your final paycheck will be mailed." Megan signed without reading the rest. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. She simply placed her ID badge on his desk, the plastic catching the light from the window, and stood up. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't flush. She turned and walked toward the door, past the security guard whose name she'd never learned, past the other nurses pretending not to watch, down the back stairwell to the basement where the hospital laundry steamed in vast industrial rhythms. Alone under the fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects, Megan pulled her scrubs from her locker and began to fold them. Crease the sleeves. Smooth the wrinkles. Fold the torso. Stack them in the return bin with the precision of someone who had folded flags over the bodies of people she couldn't save. Steam rose from the machines around her. The smell of industrial bleach and hot cotton filled the small room. She stood there for nearly 2 full minutes, staring at the folded fabric, her tarnished challenge coin pressing against her ribs where she'd kept it for 2 years. The worn insignia was barely visible anymore, smoothed by her thumb in moments of weakness. No one would recognize it as the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment. No one would know that the coin represented 37 lives saved in Kandahar. No one would understand why a nurse in Jacksonville kept a piece of military metal hidden in her scrub pocket like a confession. She had disappeared once before. She had thought she could disappear again. But disappearing required that no one had ever seen you in the first place, and Thornton's mistake was assuming that his witness had stayed buried, that Megan O'Brien was simply a nurse he could erase. He didn't know what he'd actually just activated. Dr. Thornton's office smelled like expensive cologne and disinfectant, the kind of sterile confidence that only comes from a man who'd never questioned whether the room belonged to him. The afternoon light slanted through the windows at a sharp angle, cutting the space into halves, light and shadow, winner and loser. Megan stood in the shadow half without being asked to sit. "This doesn't work anymore," Thornton said, not looking up from the file folder on his mahogany desk. His voice carried the smooth weight of someone reading from a script he'd rehearsed a dozen times. "The investigation into your unsanctioned procedure has concluded. The findings are clear. Protocol violation. Insufficient documentation of your actual credentials. We can't employ someone with your background in a Level 1 trauma center." Megan's jaw didn't tighten. Her breathing stayed level. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs, a small hard weight she could feel with each inhale. You performed a surgical intervention without proper authorization, Thornton continued, finally meeting her eyes with the kind of clinical detachment he probably used on patients he was about to disappoint. The cricothyrotomy. Outside your scope. Our investigator found gaps in your credentialing that we cannot reconcile. We need to protect this institution. He slid a termination letter across the desk, the paper whispering like accusation. Your final check will be mailed to your address on file. Your benefits terminate immediately. It wasn't a conversation. It was a closing argument. Megan reached forward and took the letter without reading it. The paper felt thin, inadequate for the weight it was supposed to carry. In Kandahar, she'd held the hand of a 19-year-old corporal while his legs disappeared into a dust cloud created by an IED. She'd kept him breathing through a shattered pelvis and third-degree burns across 40% of his body. She'd done it with equipment made from field rations and improvised certainty. This letter, this institutional rejection wrapped in corporate language, was supposed to sting? Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building, Thornton said, already turning back to his computer. The dismissal was complete. You can collect your personal items from your locker. Then you're done here. Megan nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She'd learned long ago that words were a currency she couldn't afford to spend on people who'd already decided the exchange rate. She turned and walked toward the door, her scrubs making that soft whispering sound against her legs, the uniform of 1,000 shifts, now just evidence to be returned. The security guard outside the office was a thick-shouldered man named Rodriguez who'd worked the hospital for 7 years. He'd nodded at her in the break room. He'd held the trauma bay door open when she came running with instruments. Now he avoided her eyes as she walked past, his presence like a wall she had to move around. Megan understood, he was just doing his job. Thornton had made sure of that. Everyone was just doing their job. She walked to her locker in the nurse's station and removed her things in 90 seconds. A phone charger. A photograph of Tyler from his Ranger School graduation. A half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. The challenge coin she never left behind. Nothing here had ever belonged to her anyway, even the locker number changed when a new shift came through. Then she walked down to the basement laundry, where the industrial washers hummed like a living thing, their rhythm steady and indifferent to human circumstance. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered with the kind of electrical uncertainty that suggested they might fail at any moment, though they never did. That was the thing about fluorescent lights, they kept going even when everything around them was ending. She unfolded her scrubs from her locker one final time. Blue surgical scrubs, 6 pairs, each one faded from 2 years of Riverside's industrial wash cycles. She held the first pair up and looked at the small coffee stain near the left shoulder, from a code 2 months ago when a patient's daughter had knocked over a cup during chest compressions. The second pair had a small tear along the seam, courtesy of a barbed wire fence she'd helped navigate when a pedestrian GSW came in contaminated. The others were mostly intact, mostly whole, mostly ready for someone else to wear them into someone else's crisis. She began folding with the precision that came from muscle memory that ran deeper than jobs or titles. The left sleeve first, folded at perfect right angles. Then the right sleeve, creased sharp enough to leave an indent. Then the body of the shirt, folded in half lengthwise, then in half again, creating a rectangle that fit in her hands like something already grieved. The bottom hem folded up and over, completing the shape. Not a nurse's fold. A soldier's fold. The kind of fold you used when packing a rucksack for a mission with no return date. The kind of fold you used when a flag needed to be prepared for ceremony. Crease. A line. Precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere above her, Dr. Thornton was probably calling someone, the board members who owed him favors, the investigator who'd signed off on his fabrications, the nursing agency that would blacklist her if he asked nicely enough. The machinery of his network spinning into place like a well-oiled system designed to erase people who saw too much. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Megan couldn't tell if disappearing was something Thornton had done to her or something she'd been doing to herself for 2 years. She'd come to Riverside telling no one about Kandahar. No one about the 37 lives. No one about the shrapnel she'd never reported, the wounds she'd wrapped herself because reporting them meant questions, questions meant answers, answers meant the Pentagon finding her. She'd wanted to be invisible. She'd wanted to fold her old life into something small enough to carry in a pocket. And now she was invisible. Now she was nothing. No credentials, no job, no identity that the hospital could verify or the outside world could confirm. Thornton had tried to erase her, and it turned out that erasure was something she'd already started on her own. It was just he'd finished what she'd begun. But disappearing required that no one had ever seen you in the first place, and Thornton's mistake was assuming his witness had stayed buried. His mistake was not understanding that people who'd survived Kandahar didn't actually disappear, they just waited. They just watched. They just held everything they needed to know in a small pocket against their ribs, tarnished and worn smooth by time, waiting for the moment when waiting ended. Megan placed her folded scrubs into the return bin. 12 pairs across 2 years. 260 shifts. 260 times she'd put on a uniform and pretended to be someone she wasn't. 260 times she'd kept her hand steady and her history buried and her identity compressed into silence. The metal bin swallowed them without gratitude. The hospital laundry didn't care whose clothes it was washing. It would clean them and fold them and send them back into circulation, and some other nurse would wear them into some other emergency, carrying the invisible stains of the previous wearer like a blessing or a curse depending on how you looked at it. She turned off the light switch on the wall. The fluorescent buzz died into darkness. Tomorrow morning, she would return to Riverside Community Hospital to collect her final paycheck from Human Resources. She would walk through those glass doors one last time. She would sit in a waiting room and wait for someone to process paperwork that officially terminated her existence as an employee. She would do all of this because that's what people did when they were being erased. They followed the procedures. They completed the forms. They cooperated with their own disappearance. What Megan didn't know, alone in the darkness of the basement laundry with only her folded history and her tarnished coin, was that Major Calhoun had been conscious when she saved his life. Conscious enough to see her hands moving. Conscious enough to recognize the precision that only came from having done this before. Conscious enough to spend the entire night asking the nurses who'd brought him water the same 3 questions. What's her name? Where did she serve? And how do we bring her home? He'd called his commanding officer at dawn. By noon, that call had reached a 2-star general. By evening, the general had made a phone call that would change everything about what happened next. But Megan didn't know any of that yet. She just knew the basement was cold and empty and dark, and that tomorrow morning, the real reckoning would begin. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.